Olivia, looks like you're enjoying being outside.
Yes, it's so hot inside, so I said, why not?
Oh, is it? Oh, okay. Yeah, it's crazy weather out. Slept last night with the windows open at my house.
Yeah.
Hey, Winston, how's it going?
Pretty good. How are you?
Good. Going to try and enjoy the last week of warm weather, perhaps. Morning, Mary. Good morning, Mackenzie. Marcus.
Morning.
All right. It is 9 o'clock. Do you guys have any questions about the genetically engineered organisms presentations or the assignment or any of that? All right, if I recall correctly, the assignment is on Moodle, and also in that same folder is the rubric that I will use to grade that assignment. Although let me check and make sure that I did put that in there. I thought I had, but there is a rubric for it. I just don't recall if I had actually uploaded it. Should have checked this before I came to class. Yeah, there's a rubric in there also. So you can see exactly how I'm going to go about grading it if you just download that PDF file. It's basically divided up into a set of sections: an introduction, the agronomic issues, agronomic and environmental issues, human health issues, and socioeconomic issues, and then a summation. And there are points assigned to doing different things in each of those categories, and you're rated from 1 to 5, and those things basically all add up to basically what your grade ends up being. So that'll give you some idea of the things that I'm looking for as you go to write that thing. So that is that. All right, well, if there aren't any questions, let's get back to 20th century history. We had just gone through and we had been talking about economics. And so I had given you kind of the standard economic idea of the law of supply and demand. And we also talked about how the law of supply and demand was affected by things like food, where there is an inelastic demand curve. And so instead of these curves being curved, there's actually just a vertical line at whatever the quantity of food is. And what are the reasons, again, why there's an inelastic demand curve for food, Jackson, tell me why the demand curve for food is inelastic. What do we mean by that?
You said, what was the question again? Sorry.
Why is the demand curve for food an inelastic demand curve? This curve here represents an elastic demand curve, meaning that demand fluctuates. Why does demand not fluctuate for food?
I'm not sure.
All right, Branson.
Wasn't it, you said, why does it not?
Yeah, why does demand not fluctuate for food, generally speaking? Except over really long-term periods of time. So an inelastic
Not
demand
really sure
curve.
either.
Oh, and I cannot draw on the computer. So an inelastic demand curve would look something like this. It would just be a straight up and down line. It doesn't fluctuate at all. Demand for a product doesn't fluctuate with quantity of that product that is available. Why is that the case? Somebody else, Marcus. This will be on the exam on Friday. Just going to tell you, this will be on the exam on Friday. And now I'm very glad that I backed up to this point in material that we started before we did the genetically engineered food presentations.
This might be a stretch, but is it because only supply affects the price?
No, only supply affects the price because the demand curve is inelastic. What I'm asking is, why is the demand curve inelastic? So you're correct in that price is the only thing that really affects, or supply is the only thing that affects price, but it affects price because the demand curve is a straight up and down line rather than a curve. Marcus.
I really don't have a clue.
Mackenzie.
The demand doesn't it doesn't change because it's always like it's there, like people always want it or need it.
Okay, so if food gets cheaper, how do you respond? Do you respond by eating more food?
No.
No, you just get the food that you get at a cheaper rate. What happens when food prices go up? Do you eat less food?
No.
No. What do you generally do?
Buy the cheapest of the products.
Yeah, you buy cheaper food. So physiologically, you need a certain number of calories each day to survive, and you don't really alter your food intake depending on what the price of the food is. What you may do in response to prices, you may change what you're eating, but you're not necessarily going to change how much you're eating. And so in this way, the only thing that affects demand for food is increases in population size. The more humans you have within a population, the more they're going to eat, but each individual person isn't going to eat more. And since the demand curve is inelastic, meaning that it's a vertical line, the only thing then that affects price is the supply curve. If supply goes up, the price goes down. If supply goes down, the price goes up. And so this is one of the difficulties of farming, and there are plenty of difficulties of farming, but one of the difficulties is simple laws of supply and demand place constraints on what farmers can get in terms of prices for their goods, because because food has an inelastic demand curve. So we talked about how, well, where are the farm exports? So we talked about how leading up to the Great Depression, exports were slowly declining for food. And as a result, there was this superabundance of food. There was an oversupply of food. So that when Roosevelt got into the White House, one of the first things that he did was he pushed through legislation through Congress that would allow the government to take steps to basically regulate the supply of food in order to raising the prices for food. And they did this in the Agricultural Adjustment Acts of 1933 and 1935 by basically making direct payments to farmers to take acreage out of production. And so these acreage reduction programs were designed to reduce the surplus of food with the hopes of bolstering prices for farmers so that farmers could find good prices for their products, and they would be able to make a return on their investment, because without this oversupply, there was just less food to go around. The food prices went up because supply went down, and as a result, farmers made more money. So between 1932 and 1935, net farm income raised by about 50%. And so the plight of farmers from a financial perspective was much better. Now, one of the problems with this is that at the same time that this was happening, and something that Roosevelt could not have foreseen, is that we went through this time period from the early 30s to the late 30s, where there was a protracted drought throughout the Midwest. And so at the same time that the government was asking farmers to take acreage out of production, the amount of acreage that was still in production at that time actually went down, because the productivity of it went down because of this long protracted drought that ultimately led to the Dust Bowl. This then actually made food really, really scarce, and prices went way, way up. And so in the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1938, it was a more balanced act that was designed to not only control production, but also it had an additional goal in 1938 of also ensuring adequate supply. And we talked about last time the ever normal granary, this biblical idea where during periods of abundance, you set grain aside in a granary so that when agricultural productivity goes down, you can release that grain to the public. And in that way, you can not only moderate price fluctuations, so prices become less volatile over time because you are taking surplus food off of the market when there's a big surplus, and you're allowing that food to go back onto the market during years that are not very productive agriculturally. This moderates prices for the American public, and then it also serves to ensure an adequate food supply during these years of low agricultural productivity. So the Agricultural Adjustment Acts that are up here at the top, they changed their focus somewhat over the course of the Great Depression. At the beginning, they were mainly focused on price supports for farmers because of the food surplus, but the later Agricultural Adjustment Act was focused not only on price supports for farmers, but also ensuring adequate food supply in response, once again, to the Dust Bowl. So each act was responding to things that had been happening in the farm economy up to that point. So we've talked about a number of things that the New Deal, so this morning when I got in, I just wrote up a bunch of programs that were associated with the New Deal. So we've talked about the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, Public Works Administration. These were all jobs programs focused on getting people back to work and basically investing in public infrastructure. The Soil Conservation Service was definitely an agricultural oriented program that was designed to help farmers essentially conserve topsoil. This was in the early stages. This was a program that was started in 1933, but it became more prominent as the Dust Bowl became more and more of an issue. And the Soil Conservation Service is still around with us now, and it basically uses scientific methods to help farmers, advise farmers on how to best manage their crop rotations and things like this to conserve topsoil and keep topsoil from eroding through wind erosion, water erosion, and also helps them manage their farms in ways that maintain fertility of the soils, maintain nutrient balance, and things like that. You guys know what the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation is? We mentioned this before, but I don't think we went into it in much detail. FDIC. You guys have checks at all? Do you guys use checks anymore? Do you guys go to a bank?
Yeah.
Okay. Is your bank an FDIC approved bank? Do you know by any chance? What's that?
Majority of banks are.
The majority of banks are, yes. So what is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation all about?
It insures it if like they were to like lose all their money, pretty much.
Yeah, so let's go look up. I don't remember what the limits are now.
I think per person or per account, it's like 250,000.
Is it 250,000?
I believe so.
I just don't remember because, of course, I don't have that much money. Yeah, $250,000. So basically, during the Great Depression, when the banks were going under, one of the things that caused the banks to go under was that there was a run on the banks. As the stock market crashed, people were selling off their stocks, but then because people didn't necessarily have, not a lot of people had stocks back then, but people who didn't have stocks saw the stock market crashing, and so they went to the banks and wanted to pull all of their deposits out of the bank because they didn't want the bank to fail, and when the bank failed, they would lose all of their money. And all of this basically just hastened the failing of banks. When everybody goes to the bank and pulls out its money, pulls out their money, the bank doesn't have all of that money laying around on hand. We talked before we got into the GM food presentations how when banks take your deposit, they actually take that money and they put it to work making more money. And so they give people house loans and car loans and things like this. And if people are normally just pulling out normal amounts of money, the banks know how to compensate for that, and they just move money around and give people money when they want their money, and they take that from other pools of money. And so they're basically managing your money. They don't just take your money and put it in a box in the bank with your name on it, and then that's yours to always come back to. And that works fine unless everybody who's deposited money at that bank shows up one day and says, I want my money and I want my money now. And when that happens, the bank runs out of money very quickly. And so one of the things that they did after the stock market crash of 1929 is they put in a federal program that would insure your bank deposits up to a certain amount, and that amount is now $250,000. And so if your bank fails, all that means is that the government will give you your money back that you had deposited in that bank, even if that bank is incapable of returning that money to you. And so once again, when we talk about the government, what do I really mean? I've mentioned this now a couple of times. Whenever you think of the government as doing something, or as paying money to somebody or spending money on something, it technically is the government doing that, but it would not be able to do that if it wasn't collecting taxes from the taxpayers. And by the taxpayers, I mean you and me and everybody else who has a job and pays things like income taxes. So we, the people, have decided that it's better for you to be able to get your deposited money from a bank in the event that bank fails. And as a result, we pay for the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to make sure that those deposits are covered in the event that banks fail. In the 2008 recession, there wasn't a run on banks because there were things in place like the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Now, what this also tells you is that you can keep all of your money in a single bank up to $250,000. But as soon as you get to $250,001, you should put that next dollar into another bank because that extra dollar is not covered by the FDIC rules. And so for those of you who are going to be really wealthy, you need to spread your deposits around among a variety of banks if you expect to protect that money through the FDIC. Because of the $250,000 limit. But once again, it was a program designed to keep banking stable in the United States. Another New Deal program was the Social Security Administration. Tell me about Social Security. Winston.
Yeah, like exactly what about it?
Well, just what is it?
Basic, as far as I know, isn't just like all your personal information as far as like.
No, it's not all your personal information. It's all about your money. So how many of you work for a living? Have jobs? When you get your pay stub, there's the amount of money that you got gross. This is your total gross amount. And then they take out money for income tax so that you have money set aside. So when it's time to pay your income tax in April, you have money set aside to do that. But they also take out Social Security. So they take a certain amount of money from your paycheck and put it into Social Security. What is Social Security when you see that? Money being taken from your paycheck. Somebody other than Winston.
This is for retirement.
Yeah, so it's a federally backed retirement program. I would not advise you to depend solely on Social Security for your retirement. Get yourselves a 401k or something like that, or a Roth IRA, or a variety of other ways in which you can prepare for retirement. But everybody has to pay into Social Security. Why did they want to set up this publicly run retirement program after the Great Depression set in?
What did you ask?
Why would the government want to set up a retirement program for all citizens like Social Security? So what happens with Social Security is over the course of your working lifespan, you put money into Social Security, and then when you retire, you then draw Social Security from your account, basically. That basically gives you income after you have retired. Why would they do something like that as a result of the Great Depression?
It kind of gives people like a safety net.
Yeah, so it's a safety net because what happened during the Great Depression in terms of retirement?
They lost all their money. They didn't have anything.
So before the Social Security Administration came into being, how did you get money for retirement?
It was your own savings.
Not your own savings. you don't know about these things because people don't do these things anymore. Because we have things like 401ks and Roth IRAs and the Social Security Administration. But back in the old days, how were you guaranteed a retirement? Well, let's say you worked for U.S. Steel for 40 years, from when you were 20 to when you were 65. As an employee, you would pay into something, so it has a name. Let's play hangman. I'm looking for a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-letter word that is how people in the old days used to get retirement funds. You guys know how to play hangman, right? Mary knows how. Give me a letter.
E.
E. Somebody else give me a letter.
A.
Come on. Letters. What's that, Winston?
S.
S. S is always a good one to guess.
T.
T.
What was that, Mackenzie?
T.
T as in Tom?
Yes.
Winston, did you say something?
Oh
No.
no.
No, that
No,
was
who was
me.
it?
I said T, but we both said T.
Oh, T. Okay. You guys are the slowest hangman players ever.
N.
N?
Mm,
Was that N as in Nancy?
yeah.
Pension.
Thank you very much. Who was that?
Like,
Blake, what is a pension?
wasn't it something guaranteed by your job, like a government type job? You get it whenever you retire.
Yeah, so if you work for U.S. Steel for 45 years, every time you get paid, U.S. Steel keeps some of your pay and puts it in a pension plan for you. But that pension plan is actually run by that company. So if something happens to U.S. Steel and they go out of business, what happens to your pension?
You don't get it anymore.
Bye-bye. You guys have heard about the U.S. Postal Service in the run-up to the election, right? What have you heard about the Postal Service during the run-up to the 2020 election?
What was the question?
What have you heard about the Postal Service, the U.S. Postal Service, in the run-up to the 2020 election?
Didn't it
that
get shut down?
possibly.
So basically, there were questions about whether or not the U.S. Postal Service could process all of the mail-in votes. Why would there be a problem with handling all those votes coming through the mail as a result of the pandemic?
Personnel cuts by like all federal agencies.
Personnel cuts by all federal agencies, but personnel cuts especially by the Postal Service. Why has the Postal Service had to reduce the number of employees that it has? You guys really need to be more up on the news. You guys see an article from Forbes on my screen right now? I've not vetted this, so I'm just pulling up the first thing that came up. So one of the problems with the Postal Service is the Postal Service has been hemorrhaging money for a number of years now. But the reason that it's hemorrhaging money is because Congress passed a law a number of years ago that required the Postal Service to have on hand cash enough to pay out all pensions for all employees for the next 30 years. This is something that no corporation would ever be required to do, but it's something that Congress has required the Postal Service to do. And so the Postal Service is required to fund pensions in advance in a manner that applies to no other public sector company, or private sector company rather. And so there was this move to, in theory, protect the pensions of postal employees by guaranteeing that there was enough cash on hand to do this for some ridiculous amount of time into the future. But the end effect of that has basically been that they've been running the Postal Service on much less money than they could, because a certain amount of the money that comes into the Postal Service has to be earmarked for pensions. And so pensions are still found in some arenas of the economy for satisfying people's retirement, but they really are kind of an outdated thing nowadays. The one place where pensions have become newsworthy is in this situation with the Postal Service. So before the Great Depression, if you had a job, you had a pension, and when you were retired, the company that you worked for would then pay you retirement out of that pension fund. The bad thing about the Great Depression, though, is during the Great Depression, a lot of firms and companies basically went under. They went bankrupt. And when they went bankrupt, they took your pension money with it. When the company goes down, all of your pension money is lost. And so Social Security was seen as a government alternative to putting retirement in your company's pension plan, because the government presumably is going to long outlive whatever firm or corporation you happen to be working for. And so they started doing this. And I think I mentioned before we broke for the GMO presentations that oftentimes politicians use the term entitlement to refer to Social Security, and oftentimes they refer to entitlement in a negative. They place negative connotations because a lot of politicians want to end entitlement programs. Why is it an entitlement program? Why is this term attached to Social Security?
Because you're paying into it, so you're entitled to get some of that money back out of it.
You're paying into it, so you're entitled to get that money back. It's not a negative connotation. It's just a description of how the program works. You pay money into Social Security, you should have a right to get that money back out of Social Security. So for example, if you're married and your spouse dies, you are entitled to your spouse's Social Security payments as long as you live, because once again, the act of being married ties you to that person's Social Security account through the legal contract of marriage. And so it's an entitlement program because you've paid into the program and you are entitled to get money back from that program. Now, there is a lot of talk about Social Security. That's why politicians refer to it as an entitlement program. What's the problem with Social Security that we're going to be facing, depending on who you talk to, not too long from now, but certainly by the time you guys retire?
It's out of money.
Okay, so it's running out of money. Why is it running out of money? This is such a complicated question. when you guys start working, you're going to be taxed for Social Security. You're going to have a part of your paycheck taken out of Social Security, out for Social Security. And most experts on the topic basically are saying that even though you will have money withheld from your paycheck for Social Security, you will probably not ever draw Social Security. So you should definitely know about this stuff. Why is Social Security having a solvency issue?
More people are being born.
Actually, it's not that more people are being born. This is a graph that shows the number of workers on the red line versus the number of beneficiaries on the green line. What's happening to these two lines?
Can't see the graph.
Oh, you can't see the graph, really?
Are they starting to, workers are starting to get a bigger gap on?
So workers are rising, but there comes a point here around the early 1990s when that rising worker pool starts to flatten out. But as that worker pool is flattening out, what is happening to the number of people drawing off of Social Security? Is it flattening out? So we see this flattening of the number of workers, and we see what's happening with the number of people drawing off of Social Security.
Slightly increasing.
It's still increasing. So it's not increasing tremendously, but it's going to start increasing more. It already started, has started increasing more because more and more baby boomers are retiring. And so as the number of workers paying into the system flattens out, but the number of retirees drawing off of the system begin drawing off the system, what basically happens is in 1940, there were 159 workers paying into the system for every one retiree drawing off of the system. In 2013, there's 2.8 workers paying into the system for every one worker drawing off of the system. And so there will come a point where there simply will not be enough workers to sustain the payouts that it has to pay out. But what's a problem with that way of thinking? Put on your critical thinking caps as you look at this figure. What's happening during all of those years leading up to the early to mid 90s in terms of workers relative to beneficiaries? And by the way, this is data from the Social Security Administration.
In the 1950s, there's like they really start to increase in both lines.
Okay, but which one is increasing at a faster rate, workers or beneficiaries?
Workers.
Yeah, so for a long time, for the majority of the history of the Social Security Administration, there have been many more workers paying into the system than there have been beneficiaries drawing money out of the system. So what does that do to the coffers of the Social Security Administration over time? This is the ratio of workers to beneficiaries over time. So during this time when there were tons of workers to each beneficiary, what should have been happening to the amount of money that the Social Security Administration has at its disposal?
I'd say the more workers, the more money.
Yeah, the more workers relative to beneficiaries you have, the more money you have coming in because you're not really paying all that much money out. So one of the questions that you might have after looking at these graphs is, why is Social Security in trouble when you had all of these years where there are many more workers than beneficiaries, when basically the Social Security trust fund should be essentially accruing money over all of this time? Why is it suddenly in such trouble? Does anybody know the reason for that? If you're a federal agency in Washington, D.C., and you have a lot of money laying around doing nothing, what happens to that money typically? This is just human nature.
It's gonna get spent.
Somebody's going to spend it. So when people in Congress looked at the Social Security Administration and saw that it had all of this money as a result of all of these years of all of these workers paying into the system with relatively few beneficiaries drawing off of the system, they went and said, hey, we need money to fund the activities of government. Let's take that money from the Social Security Administration. But you're not actually just allowed to take money from one administration to pay another administration. This is one of the problems with using military funding to build a border wall. Military funding was not authorized by Congress to do that originally, and so there are a lot of legal hurdles to jump through and jump over in order to get to do that. So when Congress took money from the Social Security Trust Fund to fund other aspects of the government, what did they have to do? Somebody's muttering something. Was that Mackenzie? What do you normally do when you borrow money from someone?
You pay back.
You pay it back. And so what the government has done for decades is when it takes money from the Social Security Administration, it basically issues an IOU and basically says, we, the federal government, are taking money from the Social Security Administration, and here is a voucher that basically says, we took this much money out of Social Security and we will eventually put that money back in. And so when people are worried about the solvency of the Social Security Trust Fund, the real issue is that there's not a lot of cash on hand at Social Security, because what Social Security mainly has is a set of IOUs issued by the federal government to the Social Security Administration saying, we've taken this money from you and someday we will pay it back. Now, as more and more retirees retire, those IOUs have to start coming due. So it's basically a situation where the federal government owes money to one of its own agencies. And so all of that money that was collected, in theory, should be available to people as the Social Security Administration goes through paying out retirement funds. But as their cash on hand reserves go down, they have to then go to those IOUs and say, hey, you owe us this much money. You need to start giving that back to us, the Social Security Administration, so that we can do our jobs, which is paying people as they retire. And that's the problem. When the Social Security Administration starts cashing in those IOUs, the federal government at large has to come up with a way of replacing that money. That's why there's a solvency issue at the Social Security Administration. And the problem with that is that those IOUs amount to a huge amount of money. And that makes it difficult for the federal government to then repay those IOUs, because there was never really a plan to pay back those IOUs in the first place, probably. So Social Security has been around for a long time. I wouldn't bank on it as providing you a nice leisurely retirement. I would make other plans if I were you. I certainly have been. Social Security Administration. We've talked at some length about the Agricultural Adjustment Acts. We talked briefly about the Commodity Credit Corporation. This was mechanism by which the government would make loans to farmers so that they could buy seed for their crops. The collateral for the crop for the loan was the crop itself. During years of surplus, the farmer could sell the grain on the open market, but the farmer wasn't going to get that much money for the crop anyway because it was a surplus year. Or it could basically give up the crop as collateral to repay the loan. And when they did that, that grain that the government then took as payment of the loan then went into ever normal granary. So every year you have a choice of selling your grain on the open market, getting that money and paying back the loan, or giving the crop to the government in repayment for the loan. In either case, you've satisfied the conditions of the loan, and those surplus crops go into the ever normal granary. During low productivity years, the government then has this supply of grain to release onto the market to provide an adequate food supply for Americans and to provide that food at a reasonable price. So that's kind of how the ever normal granary got started and functioned. And in the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1938, they added school lunch programs to the Agricultural Adjustment Act. This was once again a federally funded program that was designed to not only help low-income people get adequate food supply, but it was also a way of taking food out of the market, which then reduced overall supply and supported the price for farmers. And then we also had things during this time like the Federal Crop Insurance Corporation, which is once again a federal program that sells crop insurance to farmers so that if something does happen, like the Missouri River floods, if you have a crop insurance policy, that insurance policy will pay out to cover the financial losses due to that crop failure, so that once again you don't lose your farm as a result of an extreme weather event. So all these programs were present during what came to be known as the New Deal. Depression era responses to a faltering economy. These are pictures of civilian conservation corps camps around the United States during this time period. This is a poster that is advertising opportunities with the Civilian Conservation Corps. One of the other things that the New Deal did was it not only put people like manual laborers back to work, but it also employed artists and musicians and things like this to do things like create posters like this that would then encourage people to come and join the Civilian Conservation Corps. This is a sign on a grain bin. Looks like that's mostly corn inside of there, basically saying that this corn in this grain bin is being set aside as part of the ever normal granary in this process of the government taking grain off of the market during high productivity years, once again to raise the price of the crops that the farmers will eventually sell on the open market. And then that grain is stored so that during years of low productivity, the government can release that grain onto the market and lower prices for American consumers. Then all of a sudden, what happens in 1939? What happens in September of 1939?
Was that the start of the Depression?
Nope, that's 1929, October of 1929.
Start of World War II.
The beginning of World War II, Germany invades Poland, and Europe is then thrust into World War II. 1941, Pearl Harbor is attacked, and shortly after that, the United States enters World War II. And at this point, World War II pretty much digs America out of the Great Depression. They were already digging themselves out of the Great Depression, but one of the things that can certainly get people back to work is when you have a government spending a ton of money to build tanks, planes, etc. But the other things that this did is it really shook up the American workforce. When you're drafting a lot of Americans to go in and serve the military, and those Americans are mainly men, all of a sudden women go into the workforce, taking the place of men in factory jobs. And so you have Rosie the Riveter going to work to build planes and jeeps and tanks. This is a Cadillac engine going into an American tank. And so World War II had a lot of impacts on the rest of the 20th century. But in the United States, what it did was it took a country. Let's go back and look at some figures from back earlier in this presentation. When we look at mechanization on the farm, 1900, there were basically 21.6 million work animals and no tractors. 1930, 18.7 million farm animals and 920,000 tractors. 1945, we went from 920,000 tractors to 2.4 million tractors. 1960, 4.7 million tractors. Part of this jump in the number of tractors is a growth in manufacturing capacity during World War II. So when we put all these people to work building planes and jeeps and tanks, those same large engines that ran things like tanks, for example, were then repurposed after the war to go into things like large trucks and farm machinery, tractors, combines, all of this stuff. So one of the consequences of World War II was that in addition to the workforce shifting from a workforce dominated by men to a workforce that had a greater representation of women, you also saw that American manufacturing capacity increased greatly during this time because you had to build all of the things that were the machines of war. The other things that you saw as a result of World War II is you saw large increases in the building of essentially fertilizer plants, nitrogen fixation plants, and the production of things like ammonium nitrate, because ammonium nitrate is one of the principal components of gunpowder, and you had all of these bullets and bombs that you needed to be making. And so ammonium nitrate production went way up during the war. And so after the war, what you saw was a large increase in the mechanization of the farm, because these companies that had built up all of this manufacturing capacity during World War II then had to repurpose those factories to peacetime production. And so when you look at farms growing more productive, one of the things that is driving this is actually an increase in mechanization. Remember back here, we had a figure showing the number of farms relative to the size of farms. So back before World War II, we had a bunch of farms that were essentially small family farms. And then after World War II, we tended to have a fewer number of farms, which were all very large farms. And so this flip occurs shortly after the end of World War II. And a big part of this flip is due to mechanization. That ability to mechanize is actually fueled by increases in manufacturing capacity as a result of World War II. So World War II comes and goes. We have all this manufacturing capacity. We have all of this ammonium nitrate production ability. In Poland's book, he talks about the Bull Shoals munitions plant. This is in the section of the book where he's talking about the Haber-Bosch process and Fritz Haber and nitrogen fixation. In 1947, the Bull Shoals munition plant shifted from producing munitions to producing agricultural fertilizer full time, because there was no longer any need to have these large munitions plants post-World War II. So after World War II, you have nitrogen production at all-time highs, you have manufacturing at all-time highs in American history, and you have all of these primarily men coming back to the United States. And what did the government do for these former soldiers who had fought in World War II in terms of helping them assimilate back into American society and get good jobs, et cetera, et cetera? a program, once again, that occurred back during that time period that is still present if you serve in the military now.
They have like counselors that'll help you find jobs based on your skill set.
They didn't do that back then, actually. They do that now, but they didn't do that back then. They did something else.
Pay for an education.
Yeah, they did this thing that's become known as the GI Bill. If you put in a certain amount of service to your country, they will basically cover your college tuition. There are some people who go into the military fresh out of high school in order to serve a certain amount of time in the military in order to then exit the military and go to college. It's a way of paying for college. So here you see enrollment rates and graduation rates at American universities. And you see this dip during the war years, and then right after that dip, you see this huge spike in enrollment after those men come back from the military. Where were these people coming from who went and fought in World War II? Were they coming mainly from cities, or were they mainly coming from rural areas? Just based on the demography of the United States at this time in history.
Rural areas.
They were mainly coming from rural areas. And so when they then got back and the government gave them the GI Bill so that they could go to college, a lot of these people went and enrolled in what types of programs at colleges and universities?
Agriculture.
Yeah, think of schools like Texas A&M and Virginia Tech. Oftentimes these people went and pardon me, went and enrolled in college at what came to be known as agricultural and mechanical universities. West Texas A&M, Virginia Tech. All of these are kind of land grant universities that were that basically catered to agricultural and engineering programs. And many of the people who came back from World War II, when they went to college, they enrolled in these agricultural programs so that they could basically go back to the farm and be more educated farmers doing more scientifically based farming. And so in the post-war years in the United States in the 1950s and 60s, you had a kind of amazing thing happening in rural America, which was a large number of working age men who were educated in the science of agriculture, going back to farms and essentially putting into practice the things that they learned in college and university settings that were basically driven by the kinds of science-based knowledge that was gained by organizations like the Soil Conservation Service back during the Great Depression. And all of a sudden, you then have a supercharged agricultural system in the United States that is due to ready availability of nitrogen-based fertilizers, increased levels of mechanization, and a highly educated, highly skilled workforce of farmers. And those three things led to incredibly high agricultural productivity during the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. What I'm trying to get you to understand is that there's this arc of things that happen in the world from the early 1900s to the 1960s that then set up something that happened in 1972. Over the course of this time, from the Depression to the end of the 1960s, the ever-normal granary had been functioning just the way it was designed during the Depression. But it was no longer really viable because agricultural productivity had increased so much in the United States that the government was spending a tremendous amount of money basically buying up the grain from farmers and then spending a ton of money storing that grain for a food surplus that presumably is never going to come, for a food supply crisis that is never going to materialize. So all during this time when agricultural productivity is going up, where did it go? All during this time when agricultural productivity is going up due to, once again, this mechanization, The government is still continuing to store grain in the ever-normal granary in preparation for a decline in supply, and that decline in supply is just never going to probably happen. And so what happens is in 1972, once again, Michael Pollan writes about this during in the section dealing with the Sage of Purdue. A guy named Earl Butts, who was the 2 T's or 1 T? I think it was just 1 T. I'll have to look that up. He was the agricultural secretary under Richard Nixon, and he is dealing with the fact that the ever-normal granary is becoming this giant suck on the American government's expenditures because they're storing all of this grain that they don't know what to do with. During this time, we're in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, and during this time period, there's a protracted drought in Russia. And so Russia has a large centralized portion of their country that is also very good for creating grains. It resembles in many ways the American Midwest. And during this time period, they went through about a 7-year drought. And so the Russian people were suffering greatly under declines in food supply because they didn't have enough food. Food prices were very high, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the solutions to kind of thawing our relationship with Russia somewhat, and also getting rid of the ever-normal granary so that the government isn't spending all of this money storing all of this grain, was in 1972, Earl Butt said, why don't we make some inroads into Russia and sell them our excess grain? And so in 1972, there was the grain sale to Russia. This actually did thaw relationship somewhat, and also it brought in a lot of money to the federal government, and it unloaded all of this grain that was being stored, and the government didn't have to pay for that any longer. But what it did was it depleted all of the surplus stores that the United States had. Once again, just like Roosevelt during the Great Depression, Roosevelt had no idea that we were about to face a protracted drought in the American Midwest. Nixon and Earl Butts also didn't foresee that there was going to then become a protracted drought in the American Midwest in 1973 and 74 and 75. And so one of the consequences of this was the next year, agricultural productivity in the United States went way down. Prices went way up. There was a women's march on Washington, D.C., where women were marching on the mall in Washington, D.C. to protest the rising price of bread in the United States. And so by 1973, there was huge inflation, mainly driven by inflated food prices, because the government had sold off its ability to release grain onto the market to moderate prices. And so it's 10:02, and what we'll do is we'll discuss what Earl Butts put in place rather than things like Commodity Credit Corporation and the ever-normal granary. What systems were put in place after the sale of grain to Russia that then hopefully would moderate prices and ensure food supply for Americans. This is written about in the Omnivore's Dilemma, so if between now and Wednesday you want to go and read about that. So what we'll do on Wednesday is we'll talk about changes in agriculture and how agriculture gets funded from 1973 to the present, and that will pretty much be the end of test material for the test that is on Friday. Questions?
Will we have a test review?
Yes, I will put something together for you, although there was a big chunk of it on the board today.
Mm-hmm.
All right. All right then. I have not put up a food blogging assignment for the next 2 weeks. I think I want to have us take a week off. This is a weird kind of week because, as you know, COVID cases have increased on campus, and so we're moving to nothing but online classes. We're supposed to know by noon if that's going to end today or if it's going to be extended into the rest of the week. So while you're adjusting to that, I figure let's just take a break from food blogging for a week until things kind of settle in around here. I know a number of you have face-to-face classes. The provost allowed faculty to cancel classes on Friday and Monday if they weren't prepared to make that transition to online classes. Luckily for us, we've been doing online classes the whole time because I foresaw this eventuality, because it was just probably kind of inevitable that this would eventually happen. So rather than have you thinking about food blogging, just concentrate on your courses for the next week. What I'll do is on Friday, I'll put up a set of food blogging assignments that will take you through next week and then into Thanksgiving. And then we'll talk next week about what we're going to do after Thanksgiving. Questions?
Are we still doing food journal though?
Yeah, keep doing your food journals because that's not too difficult to do. But then this will just be like a 3-week section of food journaling rather than a 2-week section of food journaling. Last thing is there's an updated schedule. So I've moved some of the topics around given that I put Thanksgiving on the wrong week, and also we're a little behind. So I've rejiggered the schedule a little bit, but there's an updated schedule on the Moodle side as well. All right, I will see you guys on Wednesday. Let me know if you need anything.